Daniel had lived in his quiet suburban neighborhood for nearly a decade. His home was his pride and joy: lush green grass, a well-maintained flower bed, and a small wooden sign near his porch that read, "Welcome, friends." He wasn't the flashy type, but he appreciated the little things that made a house feel like home. Unfortunately, the new president of the HOA, Mrs. Linda Cartwright, better known as Karen to the entire neighborhood, had other ideas. Ever since she took over, she had been enforcing new rules with an iron fist. She banned things like colorful mailboxes, kids' chalk drawings on sidewalks, and even wind chimes. But the final straw came when she declared that all lawn decorations were now prohibited. One evening, Daniel returned home to find a bright yellow notice stuck to his front door. He tore it off and read the bold, capitalized letters. Notice of violation. Your property is in violation of HOA Regulation 17B, unauthorized lawn decorations. Failure to comply will result in fines and further action. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he glanced toward his front yard. His simple wooden sign was still there, exactly where it had been for years. He couldn't believe it. This was what Linda had a problem with? He sighed, shaking his head. It wasn't just him, either. Other neighbors had received similar notices for harmless things like garden gnomes, hanging flower baskets, and decorative flags. The neighborhood had always been a friendly place, but lately it felt like Linda was determined to suck the joy out of it. People were frustrated, but no one wanted to stand up to her. After all, she loved sending out fines, and she hated when people questioned her authority. As Daniel crumpled the notice in his fist, an idea began to form. He wasn't going to let this slide, not without a fight. If Linda wanted to wage war on lawn decorations, then maybe it was time the neighborhood fought back in the most ridiculous way possible. The next morning, Daniel stood at the end of his driveway, arms crossed, watching as his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, angrily yanked a garden gnome from her flower bed. "This is ridiculous," she huffed, shaking the gnome in frustration. "I've had this little guy for 15 years, and now Linda says he's destroying the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. What does that even mean?" Daniel sighed. "It means she's on another power trip. She just fined the Jeffersons for having a sunflower flag on their porch." Mrs. Henderson gasped. "A flag? What's next, banning welcome mats?" Daniel wouldn't have been surprised. Over the next few days, the neighborhood transformed. Porch decorations disappeared. Wind chimes went silent. Even the friendly seasonal wreaths vanished from doors. The once lively community now looked plain, stripped of all personality. Linda, of course, was thrilled. She strutted down the sidewalk like a queen surveying her kingdom, clipboard in hand, making sure every lawn was in compliance. Daniel watched her from his front window, his frustration bubbling over. The neighborhood wasn't an HOA-controlled country club. It was a community, one that Linda was sucking the life out of. He had never been one for open rebellion, but this time, he couldn't let it go. That evening, he called up a few neighbors, then a few more. By the time he was done, nearly half the block was in on his plan. Linda wanted aesthetic harmony. Fine, they would give her aesthetic harmony, just not in the way she expected. 2 days later, Linda stepped outside her pristine, beige-painted house, ready for her morning inspection. Clipboard in hand, she adjusted her cardigan and set off down the sidewalk, eager to admire her handiwork. At first, everything seemed perfect. No garden gnomes, no flags, no tacky porch signs. The neighborhood was finally orderly. But as she rounded the corner, her smile froze. A pink flamingo stood proudly in the middle of Mr. Thompson's yard. She blinked, frowning. That wasn't there yesterday. She scribbled furiously in her notebook and marched up to the porch. Just as she was about to stick a violation notice to the door, she turned her head and saw another flamingo. And another's. And another's. In fact, every single house on the street had at least one bright pink plastic flamingo standing defiantly in the grass. Some houses had dozens, an entire flock of neon pink birds stretching from sidewalk to doorstep. One yard even had a handmade sign that read, "Long live the Flamingos." Linda's eye twitched, her jaw clenched. She stormed up to Daniel's house, where an army of at least 20 flamingos stood in perfect formation. "Mr. Carter," she screeched, banging on the door. "This is a blatant violation of HOA regulations." Daniel opened the door, coffee mug in hand, smiling like a man without a single care in the world. "Linda, what a surprise. Lovely morning, isn't it?" She jabbed a finger toward the flamingos. "These things are lawn decorations. You're breaking the rules." Daniel took a casual sip of coffee. "Nope. According to the HOA guidelines, flamingos are classified as ornamental bird decoys, which are not specifically banned under your new regulation." He grinned. "Looks like we're all in compliance." Linda's face turned beet red. She opened and closed her mouth, grasping for a counterargument, but she had nothing. The entire neighborhood had outsmarted her, and she hated it. Linda stormed away from Daniel's porch, her grip tightening on her clipboard as she scanned the sea of pink flamingos invading her precious, regulation-compliant neighborhood. Her pulse pounded. This was an outrage. These people were mocking her. She yanked her phone from her pocket and called an emergency HOA board meeting. Within the hour, a small group of HOA members gathered in the community center, though most of them were just there for the free coffee. Linda slammed her hands on the table. "The flamingos have got to go," she barked. Mr. Reynolds, an older gentleman who had been on the board longer than Linda had lived in the neighborhood, adjusted his glasses. "Now, hold on, Linda. I've reviewed the HOA regulations, and technically, Daniel's right. The rules don't ban bird decoys. Bird decoys are for actual pest control, not for this flamingo rebellion," she snapped. "They're treating the neighborhood like a joke." Mrs. Perkins, another board member, suppressed a chuckle. "Well, it is kind of funny." Linda shot her a glare so sharp it could have cut glass. "This isn't funny, Margaret. This is anarchy." She inhaled sharply, collecting herself. "Fine. If they want to play games, we'll change the rules. Effective immediately, all plastic bird decoys are banned." She scribbled the amendment onto the board's rules sheet and smirked. The flamingos' days were numbered. The next morning, Linda strutted through the neighborhood, ready to revel in her victory. She fully expected the flamingos to be gone, but as she turned onto Daniel Street, her stomach dropped. The flamingos were still there. Only now they weren't plastic. They were wooden, metal. Some were even hand-carved, standing proudly on meticulously crafted bases. A few neighbors had gotten ridiculously creative. One house had a massive flamingo topiary made entirely of trimmed bushes. Another had a pink flamingo statue made from welded scrap metal. Linda's eye twitched. Daniel, standing on his porch, lifted his coffee and a toast. "Good morning, Linda. Lovely day for some ornamental bird decoys, don't you think?" She nearly screamed. Linda stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard that a decorative plate on the wall rattled. She could not let this go. These insufferable people were making a complete mockery of her authority. She had to put an end to this flamingo nonsense, permanently. She spent the next few hours drafting a brand new HOA regulation. Section 17C. Absolutely no flamingo-related lawn ornaments in any material, shape, or form. Satisfied, she emailed the amendment to the HOA board and scheduled a mandatory compliance notice to be sent out to every homeowner. By morning, the neighborhood would be rid of this flamingo infestation once and for all. Or so she thought. By the time Linda stepped outside the next morning, the neighborhood had transformed, again. But this time, it wasn't just about flamingos. Bright pink everything had taken over. Houses were draped in pink banners. Pink flower beds lined driveways. Even the mailboxes had been wrapped in pink ribbon. Someone had even switched out every porch light bulb for pink-tinted ones, making the entire street glow like some kind of bizarre flamingo paradise. And right in the middle of it all, standing proudly on Daniel's lawn, was the piece de resistance. An enormous, inflatable pink flamingo, at least 8 feet tall, bobbing slightly in the morning breeze. Linda's breath hitched, her fists clenched. This was war. She stomped up to Daniel's porch, practically foaming at the mouth. "This is not funny." Daniel, who was adjusting a brand-new flamingo-themed doormat, turned around with the most innocent expression he could muster. "Oh, Linda, what a surprise! Can I offer you a cup of coffee?" She jabbed a finger at the inflatable flamingo. "That is not a lawn ornament. That is a flagrant act of defiance." Daniel scratched his chin, pretending to think. "Well, according to the HOA rules, inflatables aren't classified as permanent lawn decorations, so technically," he shrugged, "we're still in compliance." Linda's face turned an alarming shade of purple. Daniel leaned against his porch railing. "By the way, did you hear? The neighborhood's hosting a flamingo festival this weekend. Everyone's invited. Pink-themed food, flamingo costumes, music. It's gonna be a blast." Linda's eye twitched so violently, Daniel thought she might short-circuit on the spot. This wasn't just a rebellion anymore. This was a movement, and Linda had completely lost control. By the time Saturday rolled around, the Flamingo Festival was in full swing. The entire neighborhood had embraced the theme. Front yards were covered in pink streamers, flamingo-shaped lawn chairs lined the sidewalks, and even the neighborhood kids ran around with tiny plastic flamingos strapped to their bikes. The smell of barbecue filled the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and upbeat music. Linda, however, was livid. She stood at the edge of her porch, gripping her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had spent all week trying to stop this madness, sending emails, issuing warnings, even threatening fines, but no one had listened. Instead, they had doubled down. She stomped through the festival, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. "This is a direct violation of HOA regulations," she barked at anyone who would listen. "You can't just turn the neighborhood into some kind of flamingo circus." Mrs. Henderson, who was dressed head to toe in pink, took a sip of her lemonade and smirked. "Actually, Linda, nothing here is against the rules. We checked." Linda's eye twitched. She whipped around, desperate to find something to find someone for. Her gaze landed on Daniel, who was manning the grill in a bright pink Hawaiian shirt. Next to him was a table covered in plates of pink frosted cupcakes, pink lemonade, and, of course, tiny pink flamingo cocktail stirrers. She stormed over. "Daniel, this is an absolute disgrace. You will take this down immediately." Daniel flipped a burger casually. "Take what down, Linda? We're just having a friendly neighborhood gathering. There's nothing in the HOA rules against community events." Linda's mouth opened, but no words came out. "And if you're worried about the flamingos," he continued, gesturing to the plastic birds scattered across the yards, "technically they're party decorations. You never banned those." A strangled noise escaped Linda's throat. She turned a shade of red that nearly matched the pink decorations around her. She had lost. But the final blow came moments later when Mr. Reynolds, the senior HOA board member, approached with a clipboard of his own. "Linda," he said, adjusting his glasses, "we took a vote. The neighborhood has officially petitioned to remove your new HOA rule against lawn decorations." Linda's eyes widened. "You can't do that." "We did," he said, handing her the paperwork. "Effective immediately, all lawn decorations are allowed again." The entire street erupted into cheers. Linda looked around, horror dawning on her face as she realized what had happened. The neighbors had outsmarted her at every turn. Not only had they won the Flamingo War, but they had erased the very rules she had used to control them. Linda Cartwright, for the first time in her reign of terror, had been completely, utterly defeated. Linda stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The neighborhood cheered around her, celebrating their victory, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. She had lost, completely. Daniel, ever the gentleman, handed her a pink cupcake. "No hard feelings, Linda?" he asked with a smirk. She slapped the cupcake out of his hand. The frosting landed on the pavement with a sad little splat. The entire street went silent. People exchanged glances, barely holding back laughter. Mrs. Henderson gasped theatrically. "My word, Linda, that's littering. Should I call the HOA?" A deep, burning red spread across Linda's face. She turned on her heel and marched away, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. The moment she disappeared into her house, the crowd erupted. Someone blasted music from a speaker, and a group of kids started an impromptu flamingo parade down the sidewalk. Daniel laughed as he watched it all unfold. The neighborhood had never felt more alive. But just when he thought it was over, Linda's front door slammed open. She emerged, dragging something behind her, her garbage bin. She stomped across her lawn and began ripping flamingos out of the ground, tossing them into the bin like a woman possessed. Plastic, metal, wooden, it didn't matter. If it was pink and vaguely bird-shaped, it was going in the trash. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Then, in unison, they all turned to Daniel. He nodded. Operation Final Flamingo was a go. Within minutes, dozens of neighbors rushed to their garages, their basements, their storage sheds. And then, one by one, they planted even more flamingos on Linda's lawn. Linda returned from the backyard, wiping sweat from her forehead, only to find twice as many flamingos in her yard than before. Her strangled scream could probably be heard from 3 blocks away. Linda's scream echoed through the neighborhood, but no one rushed to her aid. Instead, the neighbors watched with barely contained laughter as she stood in the middle of her yard, surrounded by hundreds of pink flamingos. Her breathing was ragged, her eye twitched, and for the first time in her life, Linda Cartwright had no idea what to do. Daniel, leaning casually against his porch railing, sipped his lemonade. "You know, Linda," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "they say flamingos represent balance and harmony." He grinned. "Might be a good time to embrace the message." Linda whipped around, eyes blazing. "I'll have all of you fined for this. You can't just cover my lawn in flamingos." Mr. Reynolds, the senior HOA board member, cleared his throat. "Actually, Linda, you removed the ban on lawn decorations when we overturned your rule, which means," he gestured to the pink invasion, "your lawn is perfectly compliant." The crowd erupted into laughter. Linda's face twisted in fury. Without another word, she stomped inside and slammed the door so hard that a few flamingos wobbled. The curtains in her front window snapped shut. For a long moment there was silence, then Daniel clapped his hands together. "Well, folks, I'd say that's a victory." Cheers erupted. Someone started playing music again, and the Flamingo Festival continued, bigger and better than ever. The neighborhood had never felt more united, more vibrant, more alive. Days passed, and Linda never emerged. The only sign that she was even still in the house was the occasional angry peek through her blinds. The flamingos remained on her lawn, untouched, standing victorious. And then, 1 week later, a for sale sign appeared in Linda's yard. The neighborhood threw an even bigger party that night. As Daniel stood on his porch, watching the sunset over a sea of pink flamingos, Mrs. Henderson nudged him. "So, what do we do when the next HOA tyrant shows up?" Daniel smirked. "Simple." He raised his glass. "We buy more flamingos."